Hello, my name's Brett McDonald. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to write for the Nonet Jazz Ensemble. My experience mostly comes from writing for big band, but many of the concepts you've learned about writing for smaller jazz ensembles and concepts you'll later learn about writing for big band apply to the Nonet format. First of all, let's talk about instrument ranges, because everything we talk about later is dependent on instruments sounding and playing in their best range and the characteristics of the different registers of each instrument. Let's start with trumpet in B flat. Trumpet in B flat is most typically used as our lead voice in the Nonet ensemble because trumpet naturally has a brightness to its sound which carries over the other instruments. In big band, you're often hearing trumpet play as the lead voice in a 2D section, and in an ensemble similar to Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, you'll hear trumpet as the lead voice over 3 horns. There's a solid range for trumpet in which that brightness carries through. I've written it as B flat at the very top of the bass clef to B flat above the treble clef in concert pitch. Sounding on the trumpet, that's simply a C, middle C written in treble clef up to C above the treble clef. Most of what you're going to be writing will sit within this range, but you can go beyond it. Higher, most trumpet players don't have these notes up to a high G. They can be difficult to play. They're taxing on the player, and we have lead trumpet specialists for a reason. They specialize playing in that register. There's a certain tone quality, timbre, and technique used to get those notes out accurately. And in the lower range, you start to lose a lot of what makes the trumpet special as a lead voice. It can kind of get muddy, and the response is poorer in the lower register, as now you're fighting a lot of tubing to get the instrument to respond better, since most, or if not all, of the valves are down in the case of low F sharp. Moving on, we've got the trombone, which range-wise is pretty comparable to a trumpet that's been shifted down 1 octave. So similarly, our lowest range, like I said, with trumpet is going to be kind of sluggish and unresponsive. And on the trombone, you have to add to that the player now has to move often from 7th position, like all the way out, all the way up to 1st position to make what would seem to be simple intervals on the piano happen. The lowest range now extends into the best range, which is basically the same as trumpet, basically displaced by 1 octave from an A or a B flat at the bottom of the bass clef all the way to a B flat in the middle of the treble clef. Obviously, trombonists read entirely in bass clef, so they're reading that B flat as several ledger lines above the staff. Beyond that is considered the extended range. While less taxing than lead trumpet, it's definitely not a range that you want to spend a whole lot of time in. Some of these notes are more effective as hits and shots, but generally it's a register that we tend to avoid. Okay, move into the saxophone section. Our alto saxophone in E flat is our first saxophone up. The best range I have written as F near the top of the bass clef to F at the very top of the treble clef. This transposes onto alto saxophone as low D to high D, and that's a very comfortable range for the saxophone. Most professional saxophonists can play accurately and in tune with good time in that register. When you go beyond the register on the low end, you get into the more honky bell tones that are kind of difficult to execute lines and phrases down in that register. It's difficult to control intonation, and it's also difficult to control response. In the highest register, in the palm keys, intonation starts to go very, very sharp in both alto and tenor saxophone. And so that register lends itself best if you're using it as part of a line, but rarely as part of an overall voicing. If you use notes in that register, you're going to find some pretty sorry intonation happening. Again, tenor saxophone, this is the exact same thing as alto saxophone, but we're transposing down now by another fourth. So in concert pitch, our low range, our lowest note is A flat at the bottom of the bass clef. Our highest note is E flat at the top of the treble clef. On both alto and tenor saxophones, some instruments have a high F sharp key, which means that on tenor sax you could have potentially an E above that. Generally, I wouldn't write anything beyond that, although many saxophonists can play an altissimo. It's not a register that we use in arranging very often, if at all, mostly because it's beyond the natural range of the instrument, and that leads to intonation and response issues. Keeping the tenor saxophone in its best range of about D to D means that you're going to have good response, good tone, good power, all of above. All right, now the baritone saxophone is essentially an alto saxophone transposed down an octave, so the range is very similar. The main difference here is that the lowest note is often a low A. Almost every modern baritone saxophone has a low A. Transposed to concert pitch, that's a C below the bass clef. The highest range of the baritone saxophone has a different tendency of alto, soprano, and tenor saxophones in that these notes tend to be quite flat. So it's a consideration if you are writing in that register. Once again, if you're writing longer passages that require good intonation over long notes, that's not really the best idea. All right, moving to some rhythm section instruments. We have guitar, which is a transposing instrument. It reads one octave above where it sounds. So it sounds from the low end of the bass clef, an E below the bass clef, to an E at the top of the treble clef, but it reads everything in treble clef. If you're using notation software, all of this is going to be calculated for you, but it's something to keep in mind when you're writing. The middle range of the guitar is very, very similar to the tenor saxophone and the tenor trombone. So considering the guitar a tenor instrument will give you the best results. It's really effective at an octave double of the lead line. Usually, yes, doubled at an octave, so down from lead trumpet in the tenor register. That's where the guitar is most powerful. If you start writing in the high range, the frets are not as in tune with the ensemble, and generally horns tend to play sharp in their higher registers, and the guitar is locked in intonation-wise, and so it'll just sound out of tune. And we have the contrabass, which is also a transposing instrument. So it reads from the bottom of the bass clef in E natural. Some basses have a low C extension that goes beyond that. The high range, I have it going up to a B flat. And when you hear how it sounds, that B flat, high B flat, several ledger lines above the bass clef, is sounding as the B flat below middle C. Generally, writing in the lower or the lower middle range for the bass will prevent you from writing in a register that's interfered by other instruments, such as a low trombone or a low baritone sax or guitar. And honestly, most of your bass parts are going to be slashes anyways, but it's good to know the registers and ranges for when you're writing ensemble 2D passages with a specific bass line. Okay, now let's look at some auxiliary instruments. So the first one will be flugelhorn in B flat, which is the same register as the trumpet, but it has a conical bore, and that gives it a much warmer overtone series compared to the trumpet or the trombone, which both have cylindrical bores. The big difference with the flugelhorn is that the partials get quite small in the upper register, and so it's difficult to play accurately, and thus I've reduced the extended range and the best range to go to G above the treble clef in written pitch, or F at the top of the treble clef in concert pitch. I would not really write much higher than there. You're just asking for notes to be fracked or cracked. Continuing in the brass family, we have the bass trombone, which is, as you guessed it, it's a trombone with a larger bore, and it plays in a lower register. Our lower range, I have it written from a low B flat up to an F, and F to F, bottom of the bass clef to the bottom of the treble clef, and you can go up to a B flat beyond that, but it's a bass trombone. Use it in its best register. That lower range is quite powerful, and use with caution, much like you would the high register of a trumpet. It can easily overpower a band if you're writing down in that register too much. In the woodwinds, we've got the soprano sax, which is 1 octave above the tenor sax. Similar range considerations, similar intonation issues as we go higher. I personally think the soprano sounds best in its lower octave and a half or so, and writing much higher than that can sound shrill or a little bit bright. I think a mistake that a lot of composers or arrangers make is they like to use soprano sax as a lead voice, but a soprano sax, as with all saxophones, gets weaker as its range goes higher. Dynamically, it can never really keep up with a trumpet playing in the same register if it's playing at the higher end of its range. Think about the soprano as a more aggressive tone color. You may not use it in Nonet, but it's worth considering. And we've got some doubles, so we're going to start with flute. The flute low and middle range are quite weak and don't seem to respond well over the ensemble. The high range, which I have written as G above the treble clef to a G 1 octave above that, will really provide you with a lot of clarity. Consider using flute as an octave double above your lead line. So if your trumpet is playing in the middle of the treble clef, doubling flute up an octave will really kind of add this great breathiness and wispiness to the sound. Most often the flute isn't really heard so much as felt. It's more perceived as this kind of breathy tone. It's useful to use a Nonet. I think the Walt Weiskopf stuff that I'll show you later has some flute going on, which works really well. And then we've also got clarinet. And clarinet's one of those unique instruments because it has a cylindrical bore, but one end closed, which means that it only has every other overtone in the overtone series. So it blends really well with other instruments. And it can sit on top of other instruments as a lead voice without interfering with their tone color below and without dominating the sound, which is great for a softer ensemble passage. I've split up into 4 different registers. The chalumeau, named after the original clarinet design, which was called the chalumeau. It could only play in this lower register. And then we have these throat tones. The throat tones, compared to the chalumeau, are just really weak. Intonation can be wonky and very different from one clarinet to the other. And they're kind of difficult to play because instead of pressing keys down, you're really doing wrist motions to open keys. And then going into the clarion, which is the next register, and back and forth between the throat tones is kind of just asking for errors because you passages that have leaps in that register are difficult and need to be practiced by a clarinetist in order to read well. The chalumeau is like nice and dark, rich and warm, and it works well for supporting other instruments in upper registers. And then the clarion above the throat tones is really, clarion means clear. It's got a very clear, piercing sound with a huge dynamic range. The altissimo is a range on the clarinet, unlike the saxophone that almost all professional clarinets will play up to. It does continue well beyond that high G, but that's where most people can be expected to play. It's definitely not as piercing or bright as the trumpet. So once again, if you want a ensemble passage with like a softer, high register voice, the clarinet's perfect choice for a lead voice. Moving on to the last one, we've got the bass clarinet in B flat, which is an octave below. I have it written as down, yes, to the low B flat, which is on the clarinet, bass clarinet, a low C. Same issues with the throat tones, same characteristics of the clarion, same similar characteristics of the altissimo. The clarion register overlaps with the clarinet, and the bass clarinet has a richer, fuller tone in that register. It's outside of the bass register, so it can kind of beef and warm up a unison or an ensemble passage in that register. And then lastly, I have vibraphone if you want to include it instead of piano for your Nonet ensemble. It goes from F in the bass clef to F above the treble clef. It reads as written. I would write vibraphone often in its upper register so you can get that ping. If you're doubling a line at the octave, it's really effective for that. You could also write it in its mid register, but the characteristics of the vibraphone might get lost. And that's all for instrument ranges. Let's move on. All right, now we're looking at harmonic densities, which is how to harmonize different parts using the Nonet ensemble. Our first example is the very most basic, and a lot of this is going to be review, but as we move on, it'll get more and more complicated. This is the foundation for what we're going to talk about later. Harmonic density of one means that there's only one pitch happening at any given time. That means we either have solos or unisons or octaves. So the first example is a section. You might recognize the tune. We just have trumpet 1 as solo. So let's have a listen to that. Continuing onwards, we're moving to the unison. And so in this example, I have every member of the band, all 6 horns, in at least my form of what the Nonet is orchestrated as. So trumpet 1, trumpet 2, trombone, and alto, tenor, baritone in the saxophones. We're all having each of these players play the exact same pitch. It's got a different character than the solo. It's a little bit stronger, and it's got this sheen of a unison that is a characteristic of having multiple people play the same line. Almost every instrument is in a comfortable register, and I've written this in an overlapping register, so every instrument can play within its regular range. So let's have a listen to that. Here we are continuing with the harmonic density of 1, but we've got 2 octaves going on. So I've moved the trumpets and alto saxophone up 1 octave and kept baritone and trombone down in the original register that we heard. This is a little bit more powerful. Trumpets are now in a more brilliant register. Tenor, baritone, trombone are kind of in a beefy tenor register, and alto's in the upper middle register of its range. So it's going to sound a little bit brighter, a little bit stronger. And lastly, just to kind of demonstrate how unisons can continue to be used, we've got a harmonic density of 1, but with 3 octaves. So now each miniature ensemble, the saxophone section and the brass section, has 3 octaves sounding at once. We've put baritone and trombone right in the middle of that strong baritone register. We've got tenor in the middle of its tenor register, along with trumpet 2 and alto and trumpet 1 up in the higher register. This is a broader, more punchier sound, because every instrument's now right in the meat of its strong register. And for future examples that we're going to go through, this score order is going to be implied, so you won't see which instrument is being played, but you can assume that the top voice in the saxophone staff is alto, second voice is tenor, etc. moving on to the density of 2, we're going to discuss tertian harmony. So tertian harmony is harmony that is built with stacked thirds. The principle behind it is you take the chord tone that is your lead voice and you spell down the chord by a third, either the chord or the chord scale. Once you get to the root, then you go back to the 7th and continue to spell downwards. That's kind of the basic principle of it. But we're only using 2-note density, so we're just spelling down by third. This example, you have trumpets 1 and trumpet 2 in thirds playing our familiar melody. So tertian harmony also refers to the inversions and extensions by octave of the third. So in this example, we have sixths instead of thirds, as sixths are the inversion of the interval of the third. It's a similar character in terms of support, but obviously we're using different notes and getting some different colors. Let's have a listen to this example. And just to be thorough, I'm now going to demonstrate the 10th. I've moved the lower voice now into a comfortable register for the trombone. Even though trumpet 2 could play in that register, trombone's going to sound a little bit stronger and a little bit better to match the trumpet 1. These are tenths, so this is a third plus an octave. This can be effective if you want to have like a more broader sound. And to leave space for, let's say, if you wanted to write counterpoint in between these two voices, you'd given some harmonic space and left room for that sound to happen. So here's tenths. And just to be thorough, I mentioned 13ths. This is the 6th plus an octave. I think that this sounds to be quite spread and a little bit too distant to sound homophonic. Homophonic being multiple voices playing the same rhythm at the same time. So I've got trombone in the lower register and trumpet 1 in the high register. A quirk of this harmonization here is that we have ninths happening in a relatively low register that probably would sound a little bit better as thirds. But we're sticking with our principles and just harmonizing with tertian harmony at the moment. So here are 13ths. Now, there are some rules for harmonizing lines with a density of 2 or higher. One of the principal rules is that any leading tone motion is harmonized chromatically through the whole voicing. So that means if your top voice is resolving a leading tone to a chord tone, you want all of the lower voices to follow suit and act as a leading tone to the chord tone. I like to think about having target notes within the chord, and these are the notes that I harmonize first, and then I kind of work backwards and work on good voice leading and using leading tone motion to resolve them nicely. Right here we have just alto and tenor in a 2-part harmony example using leading tones. So there's a leading tone to beat 1, a leading tone to beat 2, and a leading tone to the and of 3. And you can hear that tension on the downbeat, and I think it works quite well. So have a listen. Leading tone motion. So So that covers the basics of tertian harmony in two parts, but we can also use quartal harmony, which is harmony that uses the interval of a fourth and its inversion, the fifth. When playing diatonic music, you can encounter some issues harmonizing in fourths because you'll hit avoid tones on dominant and major 7 chords. Here's an example, and you can see it already. An accented note is on the end of 2 and the end of 4. You've got these A flats sitting on the E flat major 7s. It doesn't sound good because obviously this is an avoid tone on those chords. So I wanted you to hear the example of why we wouldn't use quartal harmony in an example like this. So here's some avoid tone conflicts. Now, where quartal harmony works really well is for modal music. So, for example, if the previous passage was written in Lydian, we would use raised fourths, and it would sound significantly better. The examples I have here are in Dorian mode, and they work really, really well. And I think you've heard this kind of motion before in the hard bop era, and especially with music with McCoy Tyner. Modal music really lends itself well to fourths and fifths, since every note in the mode is valid when improvising and when writing. Every note in the chord is basically valid when harmonizing as well. So here's two-part harmony for modal music, but it's in fourths. Continuing onwards, we can also harmonize this in fifths. Something to consider compared to tertian harmony is quartal harmony can be harder to find pitch, where a third is a lot more forgiving intonation-wise, a fifth or in a perfect fourth. These perfect intervals, just much like octaves and unisons, are less forgiving. So playing with better intonation is a little bit more challenging. When the passages are happening relatively quickly, it's hard to perceive and not really such a big issue. But if it's through a sustain, it can be quite taxing to play to try and keep the intonation in check. But here's an example of fifths over the same melody. Now we're back to tertian harmony, but we're going for a density of 3 or higher. Once again, the principle is that you're using the chord or the chord scale and descending down the chord in thirds. Once you get back to the 7th or the 6th, depending on the type of chord, you then begin to spell the chord downwards again. So good example right here on that B flat 7, we're spelling down our E flat major scale in thirds. We have a B flat, G, E flat. On beat 4, we have in C, an A flat, and F. On the end of 4, we have a D, a B flat, and G. And let's have a listen to how this sounds. So in tertian harmony, sometimes we get really clunky voice leading and more dissonant intervals between the lead voice and the second voice, especially if we're playing, let's say, a 7th chord and have the major 7th spelled up against the root. So if we have the root and then the major 7th underneath it, that doesn't sound particularly good. Even the root with the 7th, flat 7th underneath it, that doesn't sound particularly good either. It's a little bit more tolerated in saxophone writing, but in brass writing, especially if you get into the higher register, you're just asking for notes to be executed poorly. And so arrangers often, I think it's probably around the 1940s, started substituting different notes for those chord tones. So for example, on a seventh chord, you're substituting the sixth for the seventh, and now you've got a third between the first and second voice, and it works really smoothly, and the voice leading works out well. Also, you're substituting the sixth for the fifth and the ninth for the root, and that kind of gives you more color choices and an opportunity for better voice leading. So check out this example where I've substituted for the first chord right here on beat 4, what would normally be written in tertian harmony as an A flat because you're spelling down the B flat 7 chord. I've substituted for a G. I've taken that shape and moved it to beat 4 up a step in the scale, and now we have a C, A flat, G. And on the E flat 7, we've done the same thing where normally we would have an E flat and D flat, B flat. That D flat to E flat interval may not have sounded good, so I swapped it for a C. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. And here for contrast, I'm demonstrating what I said that we changed. So this is with standard rules of harmonization. You can see already that some voices are repeating, which in brass instruments isn't so much of an issue, but saxophonists definitely aren't used to reading multiple notes repeated in a row. It's not super easy to articulate. We can't double tongue, so if rather, double tonguing isn't considered a standard technique, so it's difficult for us to do that smoothly and make it sound right. There's also these seconds. For example, on that second measure, the E flat and D flat tend to rub together, and also you can hear it a little bit better on the sustain in the last measure. It doesn't really work so well, and the voice leading sounds kind of clunky. So this is why we do the substitutions that I mentioned earlier. All right, so now we've wanted to expand the voicing a little bit, but we're still only using 3 notes. And the method that you can do that is called drop 2, which takes the standard spelling of a voicing, so what we saw earlier, and drops the second voice down 1 octave, hence the name drop 2. And this allows us to use some of those standard harmonization techniques to get things like the 7th into the chord with better voice leading. So check out this example. All right, so now we've moved beyond just 3 notes, and I'm using all 6 horns. This is just standard note substitutions as we talked about earlier, but I'm spelling each chord down by the 3rd. So here on the F7 on beat 4, normally you would have an E flat in the second voice, but I've substituted it for a D natural. We have F, D natural, and second trumpet. Alto is on a C, tenor is on an A, our trombone is on an F, and our baritone sax is on a D. You know, I've spelled basically an F6 chord all the way down from the top. Okay, so I'm taking essentially the exact same voicing that we did before in tertian harmony, and now we're writing it with drop 2/4 style voicings. And as the name implies, we're dropping the second and fourth voice down an octave. This is a really good way to make what would normally sound as really bright, because of the high thirds between trumpet 1 and trumpet 2, sound a lot warmer. And we can now get our lowest instruments into a more comfortable range. So for example, if our lead voice is getting too high, our baritone sax may be out of range, we can use a drop 2/4 voicing to rectify that, and it'll still sound nice and full. So let's have a listen to this example. Okay, so now we've moved on beyond tertian harmony, and we're going to go to quartal harmony, but we're voicing for the full band now. These voicings are built from the bottom using mostly a third and seventh in an inversion that provides a fourth in its relative chord scale, and ascending fourths all the way up to our melody note, stacking them all together to make this nice blocky quartal sound. In this example, I've used tritone substitutions to make some of the voice leaning a little bit smoother, which is something you absolutely can do. And for example, let's look at that B7 alt, which is using the C melodic minor as its chord scale. From the lowest note, we have an E flat, which would be the third. Going up a fourth, we have an A natural. Then we have a D natural, G natural, C natural, F natural, just stacked fourths all the way up. Let's have a listen to this example. Moving on from quartal harmony, we're moving to piano style voicings. And if there are any pianists out there, they know exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to harmonize this using a third and seventh in the lowest two voices, and a piano player would play this in their left hand, and harmonizing the remaining voices with an upper structure triad. When I refer to an upper structure triad, I'm referring to either a major, minor, augmented, diminished triad that is not based off of the root. So for example, on a C major 7 chord, I would not use a C major triad to harmonize the upper structure. Triads like G major, E minor, D major, B minor, a G sus, an E sus, that kind of thing is all perfectly valid for the upper structure triad. So let's have a listen to these voicings. They tend to sound a little bit more punchier, a little bit more big bandy, and I like using them a lot to try to build up a little bit more excitement. So let's have a listen. Okay, so one of the issues with these piano style voicings is they can lead to clunky voice leading in the bottom two voices. That is the voices that are on the third and seventh. You can get a lot of repeated notes that move either in contrary motion to the lead voice or end up just not moving in the same direction as the lead voice. And that can sound a little bit disjointed, a little bit less homophonic, and a little less together. So this is how an example with those clunky voice leading issues sounds. Check out saxophone, the baritone saxophone and the trombone for what I'm talking about. All right, so now we're trying to solve this issue a little bit, And as long as there's only a couple of eighth notes, you can solve it by swapping the third and seventh in the direction of the lead line. So in this example, baritone leaps up by a tritone, and same with trombone, following the direction of the lead line, and then they resolve down to their respective thirds and sevenths. Right, continuing onwards, we can now use this principle of how to take these piano-style voicings and apply them to the nonet for shout sections. What we're going to do is change up the bass so that instead of being static for the whole measure, we're voice leading a line through the harmony with the bass and harmonizing it with our melody to form a lot of exciting harmonic motion. In this example, I'm using tritone substitutions and just basic voice leading in the key of B flat minor to create that extra bass motion, and then I'm harmonizing the chords using these upper structure triads. Something to keep in mind is when you're having an ensemble shout like this, to leave space for your drummer to fill up space and set up figures. It'll add to the volume and excitement. Right, in this last example, I've moved trombone to the octave double to add a little bit more punch. Our trombone and trumpets are, remember, cylindrical bore instruments, and so they can get a lot of brightness compared to the mellow tone of, let's say, a flugelhorn or a French horn, euphonium. And utilizing them together in good intervals like octaves or thirds or sixths or something like that can really add to the punch. The lead trumpet player will feel more comfortable with this trombone player on an octave double, one octave below it. I really like this style of voicing for the nonet because to my ears it sounds the most like a big band. And even though we're using half of the horns, instead of 13, we're using 6. It's, to my ears, it sounds almost indistinguishable from a big band. So now that we've covered all of the different types of examples of how to harmonize the nonet, I'd like to talk about some orchestration considerations to allow you to make really nice creative choices to make your music more interesting. The first concept I'd like to talk about is what was taught to me as magic D, which is this D in the middle of the bass clef in concert pitch. Notes below this tend to sound as bass register notes, and notes above this seem to sound as tenor register notes. And the most important principle is that the interval of a third starts to sound really muddy below magic D. And obviously, you know, a D flat to an F flat is not going to sound that much more muddy than a D to an F natural or a C to an E flat. So if you briefly dip down below magic D, that's okay. But if you're playing extended passages in a lower register, it'll sound very, very muddy and unclear. Your listener won't be able to tell what harmony or what instruments are playing. And it's just a really great rule to follow. There are some solutions, making it a unison, changing the register. All of those will work. And considering magic D, let's take a listen to some low voicings in the saxophone section and how muddy they sound and how unclear it sounds. So this is just a simple line with the full band, but but voiced in such a low register that we're breaking this magic D rule. All right, so to solve this, I've simply moved the lead voice up an octave, and hopefully you can hear how much clearer both the lead line and the harmony underneath it sounds. It's crisper, clearer, and definitely communicates the musical idea in a much stronger way. Right, a couple more orchestration considerations. Your lead and second trumpet, or if you're not using a second trumpet, your closest instrument to lead trumpet, make a big difference for the brightness of the ensemble sound. Generally, if you're using two trumpets, thirds are going to sound brighter than fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, or octaves. And so this kind of closed position, traditional tertian harmonization can sound a little bit bright for a passage that you might want to be warmer or smoother. So let's have a listen to this. It's in closed position. The interval between trumpet 1 and 2 is a third, and it supports trumpet 1 well, but that may not be the type of sound that you want. This is a little bit stronger than the type of melody that you're seeing implies, which is something smooth that might come from like the Glenn Miller Band era. So let's have a listen to the example. Right, so to change this up a little bit, I've changed the interval between trumpet 1 and trumpet 2 and made it a sixth. Now I've locked it to a sixth, but you can use different note choices that are more like a seventh or a sixth. Basically, if you drop the second and third voice of a voicing, drop 2, 3, this is the kind of shape that you'll get. Something else to consider, this first chord obviously isn't an E minor 7 chord. I've used what's called a passing diminished chord. Diminished sevenths are really useful to gain voice leading advantages, and they can sound great even over top of chords that they don't necessarily fit. So essentially I'm hanging over the B7 flat 9 sound over this E minor and then resolving it on beat 2. There's a leading tone motion on the end of 2 and another diminished passing chord. You might have heard it called a Barry Harris diminished sixth scale or something like that. This is the same principle. This type of voicing works really good for, let's say, a soft but high trumpet melody where you want a nice lyrical flowing melody in lead trumpet, but in a sensitive way that's not so pounding and aggressive. It warms up the sound, it drops some instruments into a lower register, and this is the type of thing that you would hear, in the big band swing era when you had high lead trumpet stuff. And this isn't even that high, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Okay, so we've talked about harmonization, but that's not the only tool to make your music exciting and interesting. You can also use what's called counterpoint. I wouldn't consider this jazz counterpoint to be anything remotely similar to what you would learn in a counterpoint class. The principles being one voice moves while the other doesn't in a vague way, but also writing two independent lines that kind of work on their own. It can generate a lot of excitement in the band because you have these two different voices interacting with each other, and your rhythm section now can interact with these two contrapuntal voices. Think about the sound of two soloists happening at the same time. It's a similar character, but now it's written. You can take what would have been just chords being padded out over a 16-bar section and add a line to it and make it a unison and generate the harmony that way. And that's a lot more interesting than just hearing saxophones play whole notes, at least in my opinion. So let's have a listen to this short example. So with contrapuntal ideas, you can harmonize one of the ideas without really making things sound altogether too cluttered. In this example, I've harmonized the trumpet and alto with just traditional tertian thirds style harmony, but I've retained the tenor and baritone and trombone in octaves. And you could hear each lead line independently this way, but it does beefen up the character of the counterpoint because one of the voices is harmonized. Let's have a listen to that. All right, so in contrast to the previous example, this example has both lines harmonized, which is something I would recommend against because it starts to clutter the sonic space and you lose a lot of clarity. In this example, I have a hard time discerning exactly who's playing what lead line at what time. You also run into issues where you have voice leading solutions clashing with each other at different times. And so generally the rule is you can have 3 or more parts in counterpoint, generally no more than 4. And as long as those are in unisons, the ear can perceive each of those lines individually. But if you try to harmonize them, you only can really harmonize one without sacrificing clarity. So here's an example with both lines in harmony, and you can hear how the sonic space is a little bit more cluttered and you can't hear, or there's the clarity of the lead line is lost. Another consideration is to include your rhythm section instruments in some of this contrapuntal writing. I like to use right-hand piano, which really pings and cuts through the ensemble, and especially in the nonet, the piano can be heard. So be sure to include it in the shout chorus harmony and throughout some of the lines in your piece, because there's so few musicians compared to the big band. The piano timbre will really cut through. Similar with guitar, except I would usually voice guitar down an octave from the lead voice and put it in the tenor register. Vibraphone can be used in a similar way as the piano, just as long as it's not going outside of the range of the instrument. And bass and left-hand piano, if you want to write figures together in the low register, that works really well. But here's an example using the same contrapuntal line. Now I've harmonized the saxophones and kept the trumpet 1 and 2 alto in unison, and I've added an octave double above it on piano. Let's check it out. Okay, so now there's some other considerations with unisons and how they're treated. Generally, even professional musicians will have some error in their execution of a note, And the two-part unison, that is one that's played with two players, can cause intonation issues because a good player will still be, 3 to 5 cents off of pitch in either direction. The example I have here has trumpet 1 up by 5 cents sharp and trumpet 2 down by 5 cents sharp. And that's enough to hear beats. Anything beyond 5 cents of difference is enough for the human ear to perceive beats. And so writing two-part unisons is just asking for that intonation issue of beats, that sound, that character to come out. It also can be really tiring for players to play in two-part unisons because they're constantly fighting intonation. One player's always higher than the other, and they're lipping up and lipping down to try and match, especially on long sustains. So I would avoid this and write an octave instead, or on the next page. But let's hear this example first. So the easiest solution, if you have the players available, is to simply add a third voice. In this example, I've added alto saxophone with perfect intonation, which may never happen, but just for the purposes of this example, and you can hear that this unison now gets smoothed out and sounds more characteristic, I guess. There's a sheen when you have three voices. Your ear averages all the different frequencies together, and you kind of only really hear one. So let's check that out. In the Nonet, you have more players than a small group, and so writing backgrounds becomes a little bit more important to keep the whole ensemble engaged and use all the voices at your disposal without having them sit and rest for ages upon ages. Plus, it's a way to introduce different timbres and characters into the solo section. I'd like to say that heavy backgrounds that cover up the soloist's register or natural range will get in the way of the soloist. It will force them into the extremes of their range in order to be heard, and aren't necessarily super effective unless you're building like into a shout chorus that kind of overtakes the importance of the music away from the soloist. So let's check out this example where the entire voicing basically sits right in the baritone saxophone range. So a solution for this is to choose a thinner texture, so going with a unison as opposed to something fully harmonized, or moving out of the register of the instrument, or even better, combining both of those things, in which this example does, where I have trumpets and alto playing basically beyond what the baritone saxophone can play in unison at a softer dynamic, and now you've given the baritone way more sonic space to play with. Think about your instruments in different families in terms of register. So your trumpets are soprano register instruments, your clarinet and alto saxophone are alto register, your tenor and trombone are tenor register instruments, your baritone is as it's described, a baritone register instrument, guitar is a tenor register instrument. So choosing backgrounds that don't interfere with that register will make your music a lot more clear. All right, lastly, I want to talk about some other thoughts that weren't really discussed earlier in the talk. Transcribing solos and transcribing arrangements is such an effective way to gain ownership of the sound. And you don't have to necessarily pick out every single note, but you can listen to a recording and just write down on a sheet of paper or keep a mental note in active listening, thinking about what instruments are playing, what registers they're playing, how they interact with each other, and how they're voiced, if you can hear it, or the character of the voicing. Is it bright? Is it dark? Is it in a low register? Is it in a high register? Is it exciting or not? Those are then details that you can apply to your own writing using some of the knowledge that we talked about today and stuff that you can find in your arranging textbooks. In addition to transcribing, score study is super helpful because it gives you tools and a visual reference for the sounds that you're hearing so that you can then apply it to your own music. So if you look at something like Rayburn Wright's Inside the Score, you can check out how somebody like Thad Jones or Sammy Nestico voices a big band chord, and then intuit what you would want to do, let's say for Nonet or eventually big band, use those types of voicings in a similar way and use it for your own music. Piano knowledge will help drastically in your capacity to arrange. Think of arranging and composition as applied music theory. So the more theory knowledge and the more that you can execute at your instrument, the more clarity your arrangements will have. It's a type of personal expression, and the more language that you have, the more succinct and pointed your expression will be. The instrumentation for Nonet isn't standardized, so you can have a wide variability in what you write for. And that's why we covered some of the more non-traditional instruments you would find, like flutes and clarinet, bass trombone, flugelhorn. These are considerations based on these musical characteristics. If you want a sound to be brighter or darker or more lyrical or more aggressive, these are all things to think about when you're writing. With more players than your standard three horn line combo, like the Art Blakey style sextet, the emphasis now comes on planning, because to make this music exciting, you're trying to coordinate the actions of 9 or more players. So you can't rely entirely on your soloists to build up into the biggest climax, because the biggest climax is always going to be when all players are playing. So it's something to consider and plan out when you're writing. Other things are that the tone color and timbre of different instruments have different character, as well as their dynamic at different registers. And these are important things to consider, and these are expressive choices for you to utilize. And I'd like to leave you today with just a few short clips of some examples of Nonet writing that I've found, and I'll leave some links where you can check them out on Spotify or YouTube and listen a little bit more. Lastly, I'm thankful for the University of Utah Jazz program to have me talk to you today, and happy listening. Good luck on your writing assignment, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.